#ZJLF. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so we please request you to hold on to your questions. And now we would like to welcome our esteemed panel to the 10th Z Jaipur Literature Festival. Our session for the day is called A Line in the Sand, Sykes-Picot and the Shaping of the Middle East. Our panel consists of James Barr, Christopher Sykes, Tarun Khanna, Bernard Haeckel, Robert Worth, in conversation with Vedica Kant. This session is brought to you by Amity University.
Can you all hear me? Are working? Are the mics working? It's a really exciting session to be moderating today. I'm still not sure if you can. Okay, the mics are working. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, of course, has been in the news very much over the last couple of years, especially with the rise of ISIS. And I think what we, as a panel, our panelists are aiming to do today is provide a bit more context about the agreement itself and, why it is still so important, a touch point in the Middle East. Last year, 2016, was the centenary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I'll just quickly introduce our panelists with a bit more detail. To my extreme right is James Barr, who's written the book A Line in the Sand, which talks about the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the British-French rivalry that shaped the region in the immediate post-war World War I world. To his left is Robert Worth, who was reporting for the New York Times from the Middle East for a number of years and has written A Rage for Order, where he talks a lot about his time in the region in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring. To my immediate right is Christopher Sykes, who's the grandson of Mark Sykes, and has written a book about his grandfather called The Man Who Created the Middle East, telling the personal story of, quite amazing story, of this very young man who at 35 literally helped draw a line that changed the region. To my left is Professor Bernard Haeckel, who teaches Near and Middle Eastern Studies at Princeton University. And to my extreme left is Professor Tarun Khanna, who heads the South Asian Institute and is at Harvard, a professor at Harvard Business School. Christopher, I'll start with you because I think as you mentioned in the book, the fact that the agreement is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement in a way makes us think of Sykes as the bigger villain when we think about the British and the French dividing up the Middle East. And I thought I'd ask you to provide a bit more context for the audience about your grandfather, what was his interest in the Middle East, and a bit more context about this man who at 35 helped draw a line that literally, helped kind of shape the region.
Yes, well, as you say, he was 35 years old when he was signatory to this incredibly important treaty. So how on earth did such a young man come to be in that position? Well, it started when he was 8 years old. He was an only son, the child of a very, very wealthy landowner in the north of England, in Yorkshire. And when he was 8 years old, he got a bad lung disease of the lungs, and the doctors said he should spend 3 months of the year in a hot, dry climate. Well, his father, who was a great traveler, used to travel every year to different parts of the world, but the place he favored most was what was then the Ottoman Empire. He loved all the religious sites and just loved the desert and would go on there regularly. So he began to take his young son, then 8 years old, with him. And over the years, Mark spent 3 months every year traveling through this part of the world, and he picked up a smattering of Arabic, and made friends, and totally fell under the spell of the sort of mysterious East, you know, that whole romantic idea absolutely fell under its spell. Anyway, when he was 19, he set off on his own across what is now Iraq and traveled for a few months, took all his own photographs, and the result of that was a book called Through Five Turkish Provinces. That was his first book on the area, and that was published while he was still at Cambridge. Then after he left Cambridge, he did another great travel and wrote another book, Darul Islam, which was again 1,000 miles across Iraq, what's now Iraq and Syria. He his life after university was he was a secretary in the embassy in Dublin, and then he had a job as a junior attaché in Constantinople under the ambassador there, and again then was getting more and more interested in Oriental affairs. What he really wanted was to become an MP, which in 1911 he eventually became a member of Parliament. And the subject that he spoke most about was what we now know as the Middle East. At the same time, he was trying to, so that was in 1911. By 1913, he was beginning to try and see if he could get some official post where he could use his knowledge of the Middle East. And just at the time when war broke out in 1914, he tried to persuade Churchill to use him, and that came to nothing. So he just became a soldier and he had his own regiment and was preparing to go to war. He was training to go to the front. And what happened was that Kitchener, basically after war broke out and the Turks sided with the Germans, it became quite clear that if the Allies were to win the war, then part of the spoils of war would be the entire Ottoman Empire. So they began to have to think what to do with it. And Kitchener set up this, Kitchener was the war minister, set up this committee called the De Bunsen Committee, gathered together people with knowledge of the area, and one of whom was young Mark Sykes. He literally was, what about this Sykes fellow? He's written lots of articles about the Middle East, and he's written these books. He should be a good person to have. So he was then 33, 34, and so he was brought onto this De Bunsen Committee, which discussed what they should do, and the result of that was that eventually, in 1915, he was sent off to France to meet Mr. François-Georges Picot to draw up a treaty. And together they worked on this, and then he, when in one of the cabinet meetings, and Edward Grey, the foreign minister, said, well, what are you going to do? And he famously said, I want to draw a line between the E of Acre to the K of Kirkuk. And that was the beginning of the Sykes-Picot. So
I'm going to move to James. James, if I can ask you to talk a bit more about Georges Picot and the Sykes-Picot Agreement. What was the context in which that came across? In what context did the British and French start discussing that? And I think we have a few slides as well where we have pictures of Monsieur Picot and Monsieur Sykes, as well as. Can you hear me now? I think we have a few slides as well, which, if the organizers can bring up, will show a picture of Georges Picot and Mark Sykes as well. But if I can ask you to.
Can you hear me? Is that working? So just as Christopher was saying, the situation during 1915 was, by the end of the year, that Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges-Picot were talking about this. But I might just rewind just very briefly, because Sykes was the member of that committee in Britain that was going to work out what the British wanted in the Ottoman Empire, assuming they won the war. And there was a different idea that's worth talking about just because it's a sort of what might have been. And in fact, the committee, and Sykes didn't agree with this, thought that they would divide up the Ottoman Empire into its constituent provinces, and the British would rule that part of the world through local client rulers. The idea behind all this was a strategic one. It was Britain wanted to keep other European powers away from India. That was the crucial strategic objective. Britain at that point ran Egypt. They'd done so since 1882, so they controlled the Suez Canal. What they didn't control was this tract of land east of there up to the mountains on the Iranian border. And so that was what Britain was trying to do. Sykes then went to India. He came here in the summer of 1915, and he put the idea of these semi-autonomous provinces to the British government in India. And the British government in India did not like it at all. They thought it was a rather newfangled, wishy-washy scheme. And what they wanted to see was a very good old-fashioned imperial cordon across the Middle East. And in fact, Mark Sykes was inclined to agree with them, and it certainly made life a bit simpler. And when he came back to London, as Christopher was saying, that was the scheme that he proposed to the War Cabinet. But why did he have to propose this scheme? What was the urgency of all this? Well, it was because on the way back from India to London, Sykes stopped in Cairo. And while he was there, he had a conversation with French diplomats, and the French diplomats managed to get out of him, or he admitted, what Britain was planning for after the war. And this rang alarm bells in Cairo, first of all, and then when they sent the news back to Paris by telegram in the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry. And there at the Quai, there was a group of people who were convinced imperialists. They were a small but thick-skinned group. And Francois-Georges-Picot was one of them. And he was born into a family that had long supported France's imperial mission around the world. And his father was a man called Georges-Picot. Georges was his first name. And in fact, Francois took on Georges-Picot as his full name, probably to remind everyone whose son he was. We don't know a huge amount about Francois-Georges-Picot. He's quite an enigma. But one thing we do know is that he joined the Quai d'Orsay in 1898. And that is a very important year in the history of Franco-British relations because it's the year of the Fashoda incident. Fashoda is a place, or was a place, on the upper River Nile. And in the mid-1890s, the French decided that they would mount an expedition to take control of the Nile at that point and build a big dam. And then they could turn the taps off on the dam and render the British rule in Egypt downstream unsustainable. Now, the British got wind of that and sent Kitchener, firstly to beat the Mahdi, and then onwards to Fashoda in 1898 to confront this five-strong French expedition. So Francois-Georges-Picot arrives in his new job in that year with the French very, very riled about how the British had treated him. And he drew the lesson from this episode that what France needed to do in future when dealing with the British was to treat them a lot more toughly. So, come 1915 and the French hear about what the British are cooking up behind the scenes, Francois-Georges-Picot actually arranges to have himself sent to London. In fact, the agreement was done the dealing was done in London. And so Francois-Georges-Picot manages to get himself sent to London with the help of with the help of the French ambassador to London, who was also a member of this faction, this sort of pro-colonial faction. And then, when the issue becomes a very serious one, and the British government realise they have to do a deal with the French because they're worried about the state of Anglo-French relations, Francois-Georges-Picot is the man who who's there to do the deal. So the two men met around Christmas 1915, and this is the map that they came up with. It's got the line on it that you can see, Christopher's line from the E of Acre to the last K of Kirkuk, which runs a bit like a tick across that map. And then each side of the line there are zones marked A and B, and a blue and a red zone. But what really matters in this map, there's a couple of key takeaways. Essentially, the line is what matters. Everything north of that line was going to go to the French under different degrees of colonial control, which were, I mean, it was superficial. I'll explain why in a second. Everything to the south was going to go to the British, with one exception. In Palestine, the two men could not agree. And this is one of the reasons why the Sykes-Picot Agreement is important. I think one of the uncontroversial reasons, because it then set about a British attempt to try and get round the Sykes-Picot Agreement immediately afterwards. So this deal was done in January 1916, and you can see the map there. And no sooner was it done than Sykes started to think, well, how can we get Palestine? Because when he went to see the War Committee in December 1915, he said, I want a belt of English-controlled country across the Middle East. But without Palestine, the belt wasn't a belt. It had a big hole in it. So the people he approached were the Zionists. And by then, the general climate of global opinion was moving hard against imperialism. And Sykes thought that perhaps by supporting the Zionist ambition, which had been going on for 40-odd years, to try and get themselves a Jewish national home in Palestine, that this was a way of fixing this loophole. And that resulted in the Balfour Declaration a year and a bit later on. So that was one of the crucial things. One last thing, the other important thing, if you remember nothing else about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, this is interesting, that when the two men came to sign the map in January 1916, you'll observe that while François-Georges Picot used black ink, Mark Sykes stuck to pencil. And it maybe is reading too much into this, but it does reflect a difference in pleasure that the two men had about what they'd achieved. Because there's no doubt that the French were delighted to have pinned the British down to something on paper, admittedly written with red and blue crayons, but it was nonetheless an agreement. And I'm sure that's why François-Georges Picot dipped his pen in an ink pot at this point. But the British were... For Mark Sykes, it wasn't the success he wanted. It didn't achieve all the imperial objectives that he wanted. And he personally came under criticism very, very quickly from people who thought they could have done better on his own side. And I failed to actually mention this in the book. I only found it a few weeks ago. He makes a very sort of plaintive speech in Parliament in February 1916, so just after this map's being signed, complaining about the people who are sort of rounding on him and the people who are always complaining about the conduct of the war. So immediately after the agreement was done, Sykes was under pressure. And indeed, the agreement came under pressure because it wasn't the only deal that the British had done. But I think we'll come back to that in a bit.
Yeah, actually, hopefully you can all hear me now. I wanted to move to you, Professor Heikel. We were talking before about you growing up in Lebanon and the importance the Sykes-Picot Agreement had when you were growing up. I was wondering if you could speak to the audience a bit about that. And I think then, Robert, it would be great to have you comment about your time in the Middle East, in more recent years, and the way in which the Sykes-Picot Agreement is still perhaps, in some ways, and we can talk about that a bit more, very important, and in some ways, perhaps, that importance is very exaggerated. So.
Right, thank you. You can hear me? Yes? Okay. Growing up in the Arab world, and this is true, I think, across the Arab world, the Sykes-Picot Agreement is taught to students from very early on as, an example, along with the Balfour Declaration, of imperial perfidy, imperial machinations against the will of the people of the Arab world. It is often used as the reason for the inability of Arabs to develop economically, to develop politically, to unite. It's a cause of division and of permanent weakness. In the Arab world also, things are a bit more complicated in that the empires that are bad are not just the British and the French, but you also talk about the Ottoman Empire, which is the empire that ruled the Arab world, or much of the Arab world, before, until World War I, until the end of World War I. That's also a bad empire because it kept the Arabs. The Ottoman Empire was Turkish-speaking, Ottoman-speaking, and so it kept the Arabs backward as well. So, you have a series of culprits or bad people that you can point to for keeping the Arabs behind, the Ottomans, and of course the British and the French. And I think, actually, looking back at this way of teaching history by the modern states of the Arab world, I think there are several problems that need to be highlighted and outlined. One is that this happened a very long time ago, in 1916, 1917, and the Arabs have been independent since World War II at least. So it's a way of basically saying that the problem is always with the outsider and not looking at oneself in the mirror and saying, we actually have our own agency, we have our own ability to develop, and it's not always the fault of the outsider. So it's been used as a way of justifying bad politics, authoritarianism, and all kinds of ways of behaving by governments. And it's also fostered ideas about conspiracy theories that are very prevalent, that it's always, some backroom deal that keeps you weak. So I think that's been one effect. The other that I should also point out is that there are certain groups in the Middle East or in West Asia who are beneficiaries of this deal. So for instance, if you talk to the Christians of Lebanon, especially the Maronites, my father is one, they love this deal because, in fact, they were beneficiaries as a community by being given Lebanon, the country, which was carved out of Syria. Of course, I think also Zionists are quite happy with this carve-up because it ultimately led to the creation of Israel. So it's a very complicated history with all kinds of ramifications for different communities and also different ways of justifying, exonerating forms of politics that are not healthy, actually, for the region as a whole.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in one of the striking things about what happened in 2011 when you had this groundswell of protest, popular protest across the Middle East, was a rejection of many of the pretexts that had been used for so long by Arab autocrats to justify their rule. And one of those, of course, was imperialism, anti-imperialist rhetoric, and anti-Zionist talk. I remember being in Benghazi in Libya in February 2011, and on a television screen was Ali Abdullah Saleh, the ruler of Yemen, who was complaining about these protests and saying it's all an Israeli plot, it's all an American plot, it's all an imperialist plot. And there were a big crowd of young Libyans, and actually not just Libyans, there were some Egyptians who'd come over to participate in the Libyan protest, and they just burst out laughing. There was a feeling of, this kind of talk is unacceptable. We've had enough of this. We now want to talk about our own societies and our own problems and to solve them in our own way. Unfortunately and tragically, I think, those feelings didn't last because there wasn't enough unity. The calls for democracy were too vague and they were not deeply rooted enough. And so as these countries then began to fall apart in a variety of ways, along sectarian lines, along political lines, along tribal lines, there was a reversion to the kinds of rhetoric that you'd heard, which after all of this talk about Sykes-Picot being the source of all evil was not just to blame somebody else for your troubles, but to create solidarity in societies that didn't have much solidarity at all. And one of the places that I saw this in the years that followed was in Syria, where, you know, when you met Syrians, one of the things that they would repeat, Iraqis as well, like a kind of a totem, was, we're all Arabs. You know, and Syria is the beating heart of Arabism. We're all together. We're all united. And there was a kind of almost a panicky assertion that this was true, because it meant to cover up. It was always meant to cover up the difficulties these countries had in creating this national glue. One of the chapters of my book is about two young women in Syria who had been best friends since childhood. One of them was from a Sunni family, one was from an Alawi family, which is the family, of course, of Bashar al-Assad. And the regime is dominated by Alawis, who are a minority in the country. And in the years prior to 2011, these two young men were aware, of course, of these divisions, but they had been pressed into the background forcefully by the state in all kinds of ways, so that their friendship was possible. As soon as those protests happened, the regime then began to manipulate and make use of these differences to push people against each other, because despite the fact that they had, you know, publicly created this notion of Arab unity, they had always had in the background the threat for the Alawis, you know, if you don't listen to us, the Sunnis will come get you. And so as that grew worse, you had different narratives coming out. People who were Sunni, like the young woman I'm talking about, watched Al Jazeera, which had a very Sunni-oriented Arab nationalist narrative of tearing down these evil regimes. And the more Alawi and Shiite-oriented news, sometimes coming out of Lebanon and Iran, was, this is all plot. This is all plot by the West. And these two narratives created two worldviews that were ultimately irreconcilable, and that not only created this horrible civil war that still goes on, but tore apart this particular friendship. Eventually, the Sunni woman and her family fled to Turkey, and the Alawi woman remains in Syria.
It's the most moving chapter in the book, I think, and I had actually read it as, if I'm not wrong, as the New York Times article. And it kind of comes back to the ways in which these kind of arbitrary lines and arbitrary groupings of people and kind of what colonial powers centuries ago had done can still play out. And I wanted to come to you, Professor Khanna, at this point and kind of talk to you about the kind of comparative comparison there between this line that Mark Sykes and George Picot drew across the Middle East and what we saw in South Asia with the partition, and ask you to talk a bit more about what we were discussing earlier today, which is the partition project at Harvard, and the ways in which the partition is again something where you had a colonial power that drew that arbitrary line, and it's not just a physical boundary, but it has had repercussions, political and social, that are still carrying on.
Thank you, Vedica. So I'm obviously not a Middle East remotely an expert, but I think the reason that I'm on this panel is maybe to raise some general issues that, to me anyway, as an outsider, as somebody who is more familiar with South Asia and a student of the partition of British India, has some resonance with this. And we had a very intriguing conversation right before this panel about the extent to which the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as opposed to the line that separated Pakistan from India, were very differently negotiated. Perhaps, the impression perhaps was that there was more local voice and local agency, to use Bernard's term, in the South Asian case, where there was clearly a well-articulated demand for a separate Muslim nation. There were other interest groups who were represented in the political back and forth. And I found myself thinking that it's not so clear to me that it's conceptually that different. I mean, empirically, it may have played out differently, but I think there's a lot of learning from the standpoint of scholarship and writing to compare and contrast different such shocks to the political system. Sorry about that. I'll try to hold it closer. And I thought I would just share maybe. So there is a partition project that we've been running now for some years at Harvard, and I'd encourage anybody in the room who is interested in the partition of British India to get in touch with us. And what I think is novel about this is that, of course, we have lots of people who write about the partition experience from different lenses, many of whom are probably in this room. We have historians and political scientists who, by the nature of the partition of British India, would have been interested in it. But what we're trying to do is perhaps a little bit out of the box as well. So we're including a lot of painters and humanists and musicians, trying to see how you can capture the experience of partition through different disciplinary lenses. We're even including mathematicians. I'm a mathematician, so I'm biased. And saying, can we recreate data, even recreate oral memories of people who went through the partition process, for instance, people in my family and many families in this room probably, and then use statistical techniques and mathematical techniques to recover patterns of lost memories. And just a simple example of something that could be quite different and insightful, and speak to a set of issues that I think also relate to the Sykes-Picot and the residue of all these changes in the Middle East. And I thought I would just enumerate a few of these general issues that come up both in the partition of British India as well as in the formation of the model of Middle East. And they all have to do with the creation of institutions after the fact, if you will, that hopefully would move societies forward productively, or very often seem to end up not doing so, and we end up sort of meandering around. One is that the process of creation of these institutions is incredibly slow. I was joking this morning in a different meeting that whenever I ask my students at Harvard, how long do you think X situation is going to resolve itself, whatever X is, our undergraduates are horribly optimistic, or perhaps encouragingly optimistic, and typically offer the median response of 5 years. We'll fix this in 5 years. The political turmoil will settle, people will be happier, we'll realize that it's all hunky-dory. And of course, the truth is that it's generations in many instances. And so communicating the idea that institutions take a long time and being realistic about that is, I think, a useful thing to reflect upon. And the experience of the Middle East is not a particularly salubrious one in this, on that front. The second is that I know in India we frequently resort to a lovely moniker, public-private partnerships are the things that are going to solve everything. And of course, they never do. I mean, that's overstating it. But usually somebody has to. It's either the civil society takes the first step and leads, and the state follows. Sometimes the state's in disrepair, and the state itself needs to be repaired. But there is a sense in which different parts of society have to come together, and that, I suppose, is what political leadership is all about. And the third thing I wanted to emphasize is the idea of individual behavior. And of course, it comes through in the narratives that we're hearing about in the different eminent folks on this panel who've written about the Middle East and different people who lived through it. There's a lovely project that one of my colleagues, who is a human rights activist and a physician, Jennifer Leaning, at Harvard, is doing on how people actually behaved during the partition. And we've heard many, partition of British India, we've heard many stories of bloodshed and violence and mayhem and so on and so forth. And what she's been uncovering through the archives is lots of much more heartening stories of everyday people behaving in very human ways and trying to reach out and help each other. And I know there are some stories like this from my own family. And really an interesting domain of scholarship is to uncover what actually happened at that time and bring that personal behavior out to the front lines in some ways. And that's, of course, what we hope to do with the Partition Project also, because ultimately it's that individual behavior that leads to the creation of the institutions that might repair some of the ruptures of these arbitrary lines, whether it's the Sykes-Picot or the Indo-Pakistan border.
Thank you so much, Professor Khanna. Just also kind of picking up on your point, when you talk about blaming the colonial powers for everything, that's something we like to do as well. So there's a comparison there as well. But I'd just like to come back to you again, and kind of and you, James, as well, and kind of get other people to join in as they see fit. When we talk about Sykes-Picot, how was Sykes-Picot coming up in your conversations with people in the Arab Spring? You spoke a bit more about that. You spoke a bit about that. But when we think about Sykes-Picot, you mentioned that this line was created, but very quickly afterwards, Sykes himself realized that he wasn't perhaps that happy with it, and the British were already, making other deals, whether it was the Balfour Declaration or the McMahon letters to Sheriff Hussain, and those weren't the only deals that were done. I mean, we completely forget the Ottoman Empire and the fact that the British had decided, not just the British, but the Allied powers were thinking about how to carve up, you have a rump Turkey in Anatolia, but a separate Kurdistan and Armenia. So there were these multiple deals that were done, in many ways overlapping. So how important really is Sykes-Picot? Are we overstating the importance of it? And has it just become this kind of easy term to use in the Middle East to say, well, as we were saying, to blame someone, yes, Sykes-Picot was a problem?
It's a very good question. I think the important thing is that, Sykes-Picot did survive the war. People tend to think that because the current map doesn't look like the Sykes-Picot map, that it's sort of irrelevant. But it is relevant because ultimately, it said that France would rule part of that part of the world and Britain would rule the rest of it, and that is what came to pass. The only bit of the Sykes-Picot map that you can still see is in the Syrian-Iraqi border, really from the Jebel Druze up to just past the Euphrates. And that diagonal line is very much part of the E of Acre to the last K in Kirkuk line that Sykes proposed. But the rest of it was, as you've just said, it was affected by other events. And the most important of them was actually the fact that the Turkish nationalists fought back and established a border that was well into the territory that the French thought they were going to have. But from the British point of view, they got in the end, they got what they wanted, because they wanted a belt of English-controlled country, and that's what they got, because if you look at the countries today, Iraq, Jordan, and now Israel, they all join up, and at one point they were all British-controlled. So in that respect, they did get what they wanted. And they got more, because the other thing that Sykes had not thought about, the thing that this deal was not about, was oil. Oil didn't come into the thinking. It was all about the control of the land route from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. And in fact, Christopher, in your book, you describe this, it's really a journey that's an epiphany for Mark Sykes. In 1910, he goes from Aleppo down to Raqqa, down to Fallujah and Baghdad, all places that at the time would have been barely known to a British audience or an international audience, but now are names with a lot of weight attached to them. And he did that trip. He went down the Euphrates, and the angle of his 8-acre Kirkuk line bisects the Euphrates exactly at the point that he thought that Britain should run. So there's a kind of rationale to it.
Yeah. I think another way that this is invoked now, I was actually really struck that when ISIS came and swept from Syria into Iraq, suddenly in the European and American press, you saw lots and lots of sort of think pieces. Is this the end of Sykes-Picot? Sykes-Picot, by the way, I think has become a kind of a figure for the broader sense of colonial involvement in all these various different deals. A sense that the whole Middle East was going to change. And in a strange way, I think they took their cue from the jihadis, because when the ISIS jihadis swept over that border, they destroyed the berm that was served as the border between, at least in places, between Iraq and Syria. And then they put out, one of their many communiques saying, we are destroying Sykes-Picot, we are destroying this colonial world, and it'll soon be gone. I think many of us took that much too literally. When in fact, the possibility of really changing borders and creating new countries is it's preposterous, really. It was hard enough 100 years ago, but the idea of doing that now. There was a striking newspaper, actually, op-ed in the New York Times about a year and a half ago by John Bolton, the mustachioed former U.S. ambassador to the UN, and now, again, part of the U.S. government, who said, we just need to create a Sunni state. That's the solution. As if Sykes and Picot could be brought back from the dead to create a brand new country and create institutions and police it. In fact, if it were that easy, it might be a good idea. But I think the reality is that probably we're stuck with those borders for the time being, simply because there's an awful lot of inertia on an international border, and there was nobody out there who was willing to make the effort to create a new one.
Yeah, actually, one of my other points was that we always say, or at least when talking about the Middle East, there is so much criticism about the fact that these are imposed borders. And as we were discussing earlier, the fact is that these have been states for now almost a century. So you can't also say that there is no Palestinian identity, or there is no Iraqi identity, or there is no Syrian identity. As imperfect as they are, there is some kind of identity of those countries, even if there is sectarian tension or ethnic tension. But Professor Heck, if I could ask you to comment on Sykes-Picot very quickly again on its continued relevance, and then perhaps go to the audience for questions.
You know, I think that you know, Sykes and Picot are imperialists. However one wants to, you know, think of them, I think they did believe in empire. What happens, though, at the same time, and this was not entirely their doing, is the arrival of nationalism, which is, of course, also a European idea. And the idea that nationalism should either be located in a cultural, an ethnic community or a linguistic community or a particular religious sect, that would be the basis for nationalism. And this idea comes to the Middle East along with President Wilson's notion of self-determination for peoples. The problem for the Middle East, and as it is for South Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, as I would rather call it, because that's really how it should be called, is that, you know, these are territories with very mixed populations. Linguistically, religiously, ethnically, and so on. And so to create a nation that is quote-unquote pure means to inflict violence on those who are impure, who are not members of the community that you're trying to establish, in whose name you're trying to establish a state. And that really is the violence of the 20th century on the Middle East, because there has not been a formula, a political formula, in which you know, a state can be based on a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, in other words, multi-religious, a multi-linguistic territory. And that has been the tragedy, for instance, of the Kurds, of the Palestinians, now of the Christians in Iraq and increasingly in Syria. That is the problem. And I think this is where maybe India can offer something very substantive, which is that, that in India, leaving aside the rise of Hindu nationalism, you do have a model that is where you have a state and you have a nation and you have many different linguistic groups and you have many different ethnic groups, you have also many religious communities, and somehow you've managed in sometimes messy ways but sometimes elegant ways to pull it off. And that is something that the Middle East has not been able to do.
I have to tell you a story. When I was studying in Turkey, I used to go for Turkish class, and my Turkish teacher said to me, well, you speak very good English. And she said, but didn't the British colonize you? And I said, yeah, but we didn't hate them, so we still, you know, we kind of hate them, but we still learn their language. And I said, but we also are multilingual, and we learn many, you know, we speak a state language, we also have Hindi, and we also learn English. And she said, well, don't you just have one national language? And I said, no, unlike Turkey, which only has, at that time, they hadn't allowed Kurdish to be broadcast yet. I said, no, we have many languages, and it is allowed to speak them, and you know, we have 10 national languages, or official languages. We don't have any national language. And she said, but then how can you be a country? And I thought that was very, very telling, the fact that, as you mentioned, that kind of linguistic nationalism and ethnic nationalism is so central became so central to the Middle East. On that note, I'll very quickly open up to questions from the audience. I'll start from the back, actually, or the middle, so that we don't forget people there. There's a gentleman in a striped shirt. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mr. Taleb, just a comment. I think there are people from 3 countries here, Sri Lanka, India, and Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, who would not want you to say that this is about the Indian subcontinent, that it's a little bit imperialistic. Anyway, question. Question. Where did the Armenian genocide of 1916 figure in this whole dividing up, and why was it not considered by the British and the French at that time?
I think the short answer to that is awareness of the genocide grew after the deal was done, but then the deal was a fix. The deal was a fix to fix a problem between Britain and France over strategy and over French and British suspicions about each other in the Middle East. But actually, coming back to what Tarun said, I mean, thinking about Britain had a long history of map making and frontier building around the world, in particular in this country, on the borders. But the characteristics of this deal are, you know, a line on the map across it. There's no attempt to try to create any sort of, you know, to acknowledge geography or ethnicity or anything in this deal, and that's because that's not what it was about. The bizarre thing is that it did have a bigger influence on the post-war geography. Actually, after, and this is Christopher talks about this in his book, that Sykes sort of became quite almost penitential about the situation after he'd done the deal. And he started to think more in terms of ethnic groups. So he thought, partly because the Zionists became part of his how to fix the problem, he then also started thinking about the Armenians and about the Kurds, I think, if I'm right, and started thinking more about whether they would have some sort of autonomy after the war. So that was a possibility, but then of course Mark Sykes died, and at the peace conference the great powers intervened and decided what they wanted, and particularly, I mean, the Armenians obviously were living right up to the coast of the Mediterranean, but the Kurds, the other group that people always talk about, were sort of landlocked, and as far as the British were concerned, they were not someone whose interests needed to be respected at that time.
James, just to add to that, I mean, the Armenians are recognized in the peace deal done with the Ottomans at the Treaty of Sèvres. The Armenians are given their own separate country. It's just that treaty is negated by the fact that Mustafa Kemal wins, the nationalist forces win in Turkey, and they renegotiate what then becomes the Treaty of Lausanne, and then the Kurds no longer get a separate country, and the Armenians are also given short shrift because circumstances change. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the post-war settlements, is that, you know, things on the ground change. You might make lines on maps, but you know.
Just one other thing to add is that the British actually did think that the Armenians might be able to help them, because one of the other what-ifs is that the original Gallipoli plan was to land at Gallipoli, but also at Alexandretta, which is the port at the crook of the Mediterranean where Turkey and Syria now meet. And at that point, they thought the Armenians, because they were Christian, would be a friendly force, and that they would essentially be able to encourage a local uprising there. So they were well aware of their existence, and people like Mark Sykes had described them very well in his books.
Yeah. Do you have a question here? The lady in black? Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. So I was just wondering if the creation of the line in the sand increased the diversity of the Arabic cultures in just dividing those two countries. Did it help in creating more diversity in the cultures between the states?
I think what ended up happening was less diversity rather than more. Not least because you ended up with territorially bounded states, where the state imposed a single sort of culture, education, and if you look at a country like Iraq, for instance, the Kurds have been denied until 2003, linguistic rights, educational rights, all kinds of rights, and have been forcibly moved and so on. So no, I don't think, in fact, when it comes to diversity, we've seen an increase. In fact, we've seen a very significant decrease and large migrations of people who don't fit in one country into another or overseas. So large diasporas were created.
Sorry, I'm a bit croaky. Both England and France had been fascinated by the Middle East for a long time, and Orientalism had been alive and well for over 100 years when this treaty was signed, and people like T.E. Lawrence and Gertrude Bell were involved in the implementation. I'd be interested, did they have any input at the start of the process, or did was the influence a purely functional thing after the deal had been done?
Did Lawrence and Gertrude Bell have an influence on the deal?
Well, and the general scholarship and understanding of the area, Edward Said, of course, would take a negative view about that, but the body of knowledge that both those countries had obtained over a century, the previous century, did that have any influence at all in the membership of the committees, or the way, or the material that came before the committee, or as I say, in terms of contributing to the understanding of, or contributing to the structure of the deal?
Yes, sort of. What Britain was very good at doing was deploying its experts to the Middle East when the war began. And so Gertrude Bell was Britain's only female political officer, I think, at that time. But she was, undoubtedly an expert who traveled very widely in that part of the world. Lawrence also was sucked into Cairo very early in the war and initially was involved in map making, but then found himself a bigger and better job. And that explains to some extent why I think Mark Sykes was the man that the cabinet turned to, because he was the one expert who was still in London at that time. But Lawrence didn't know about the deal until it was done. There's uncertainty about exactly when he knew, but he certainly met Mark Sykes on the coast of Arabia in May 1917, and I am fairly certain that Mark Sykes at that moment explained, probably with a map, what he had in mind, and Lawrence hated it. Lawrence thought that Sykes was a complete amateur, not in a positive sense of the word either. Lawrence had travelled around the Middle East on a very low budget. He went out to Beirut to look at the castles before the war. He bought a pistol at the start and he sold it at the end for a small profit. Mark Sykes, on the other hand, had a lot more money and travelled in a great deal more style. And Lawrence felt that he was he had a rather sort of insulated view of the Middle East. And Lawrence, from then on, was determined to destroy the Sykes-Picot Agreement from then until the end of the war.
I think we have one question. I don't want to leave out people at the back.
I think that you started to talk about Muslims, and there was this third element, the Arab revolt, and the attempts of the British to put a Hashemite king in Syria, and then to put him in Egypt, and to create new states like Jordan. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the attempts of the fights between the British and the French to carve out different elements using the Arabs and the promises of the United Arab Kingdom in the Middle East.
Me again, sorry. Yes, and I left that hanging when I talked earlier on, but one of the reasons why the Sykes-Picot map had those differentiations was because at the same time that Britain and France were cutting this deal, Britain had also promised an enormous empire to Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who they expected to be their puppet after the war. And so the initial British plan was an Arab empire that they would control. Then when the French got wind of that, the British were forced to do a deal with the French. But this then creates this tension throughout the war. And it was that Lawrence was trying to exploit, because Britain was backing the Arabs. It was sending Sharif Hussein 100,000 gold sovereigns a month, or 100,000 pounds a month, sorry, and arms and ammunition and explosives. And Lawrence arrives at the end of 1916 and offers himself as an advisor and tells Faisal, Sharif Hussein's son, very quickly that their job is to get to Damascus before the end of the war. And Lawrence's meeting with Sykes on the coast of Arabia in May 1917 reinforces the need to get this done, because if you look at what Lawrence then went on to do, it's clear that he had seen the Sykes-Picot map, because he tries to get the Arabs into the area that Sykes had promised to France before the end of the war. That's why they had to get to Damascus. That's why they had to get to Daraa in the final stages of the war, because Daraa was just north of the line in the sand. So it was all very, very important. And Lawrence thought that if they could get into Damascus first, then that they would have a good chance of destroying the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which up to then was just a piece of paper, and one that very, very few people knew about. So from Lawrence's point of view, it was about creating facts on the ground.
I think I think we have one last question that the organ. Can we have just one? Oh. I know. I think we are actually done with questions. If you have any particular comments or questions for the for any of our, I'm sorry. If you have, if any final comments from any of you, if any of our audience have further questions or comments for any of the panelists will be available to speak to you as we get off the stage. Thank you very much for attending the panel, and we hope you found it interesting.